Okay, in this one we're going to go over Ayn Rand's view on history and show why it's erroneous, and show basically some points with it. We're wondering if it would actually have an implication on things like uh, her view of objectivism, and if objectivism would have actually come about, as well as looking at the point of the thing of looking at her foreign policy view and why it was so ultra hawkish and why that was possibly so. First of all, let's look at her history view. Her history view was essentially basically where she viewed in what has been reported in many history books of what happened on World War I and World War II. And this is frankly has been widely reported as being highly erroneous on the actual origins of it. And it's basically meant to hide the sins of both Great Britain, the US, and also France in the whole thing. And it's likely, and we start to look at it, it's likely basically because she was focusing mostly on her views of looking into literature and not really focusing on, at the time, what was going on around her, number one. And number two, number two is actually looking at the actual historical evidence before her with it as well, what was actually happening. Now, this is actually really important to know, because when you're not actually being looking at historical evidence and actually really looking into what was going on, because a lot of the stuff might not have been directly noticeable. And that's something that's very, very important to know. And this can actually really have an implication on your viewpoint. And if you start to have a viewpoint that's erroneous on history, it's going to start to color your viewpoint on things, and it can actually lead to erroneous views in the future. And her viewpoint on it, on both wars, was basically, on the first war, was basically it was started by German aggression. Now, we know this to be completely false. We know this is essentially, it was started by the paranoia of the United Kingdom, that they felt it was the actual trade deal between the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Germany was felt by the United Kingdom as an encroachment on their empire. And they had paranoia over it, and they were the ones who initiated the attack over it. Now, there was nothing wrong with neither what the Austro-Hungarian Empire did, nor what Germany did. And when people start to mention things like the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand with it, that's completely pointless, because it had nothing to do with the war. That was actually just a regional conflict. And it would basically be equal to like a governor being assassinated to say that started a governor of the United States being assassinated to say that started a world war. That's complete by local people who are upset. That would be viewed as completely erroneous, and everybody would have known that. Now, it could start obviously a regional war or a war within the state with it, but obviously we know that didn't happen. So when we view this, we know that her idea of the First World War was erroneous. Now her idea on this, this plays well into the Second World War, and everybody knows that the actual sanctions on Germany actually played into the rise of Hitler. Now, when she states that erroneously that World War II was necessary because of Hitler's aggression, she ignores the fact that basically that it was the actual actions from World War I, of the sanctions on it, that actually created the rise of Hitler. So this then creates another erroneous point. And she also was making mention on Japan as well. And this is another point that's erroneous as well, because the United States, she ignores the fact the United States was creating an actual blockade with China to actually block food and supplies going into Japan, causing huge economic hardships that they were basically going to definitely retaliate against the United States. And the United States knew about it in well more than 2 weeks in advance, was holding on to that information so they would get attacked. And this is basically common knowledge. It's been common knowledge for a while. And when you have this erroneous basis of history, it's going to really color some of your ideas on foreign policy, as well as it might even color your ideas on your philosophy. Now, if you start to take on some of these points with it, it might have been that her philosophy might not have come about. While she might have been a writer with it, she might have gone in a different direction. Now, here's where we get to the point of of where I'd like to discuss of would objectivism come about. And I believe some sort of a point of it would have. It just wouldn't be in what her total vision was of it, because we've had people in the past with it, with some of the past Greek philosophers that were actually bringing on many of these ideas. We also go into some of the ideas of some of the ones that actually reiterated many of the points, but kind of narrowed it down to a lot of the ideas of natural rights, such as like Thomas Aquinas, and also going into people such as Ludwig von Mises, who's an Austrian economist who actually lived through all of the stuff of the rise of Hitler and knew it far better than anyone else, and would have been able to really grasp what was going on. Wasn't necessarily focusing on the stuff, but knew what was going on, what real government tyranny was, and knew that the government was actually basically burning his books, and that's why he came to the United States. And he knew what actual real freedom was. And this is where we get to a serious, and most of his ideas are really where a lot of the Libertarian Party comes from. And while they tend to take some of the ideas of Rand, they also really kind of cornerstone to some of his with it, and he understood this. Now, when we start to look at foreign policy, now, if you look at some of the ideas of foreign policy when she would have basically been possibly researching it, really there basically was, for information out there, pretty much it would have been very, very limited to basically the Marxist perspective, the realist perspective, and the liberal perspective. And frankly, when it comes out to it, the Marxist perspective would basically be about eliminating any companies who've actually come into a state that are actually using that state's resources for both that state and and their home state amongst other countries that they can trade with. They would actually be acting in their own accord, but it would also be hiring people locally, which would benefit. But the Marxist perspective would not recognize that. They'd recognize them as essentially as parasitic, because they would think only an internal company could do this. You would have so that they would view that as a reason for intervening. This is something that she would not have recognized. You would see the realist perspective, which would be something in which we see that she would be going after, which would basically say anything that goes away from the current status quo and current harmony of order would essentially be something in which you would intervene to essentially reestablish the harmony of order. And that would be another thing in which she would be against, because if she felt that a country was oppressing its people, it would not accomplish its goals. And that leads her down to that liberal foreign policy perspective. But she doesn't necessarily want to fully commit to it. And this is where we get this really schizophrenic thing where she wants to have, like, essentially the conceal your sins with it and try to focus on that realist idea of the realist of what it called, of say, this is really our approach. But we wanted to basically, we want to create this like utopia, but this is really more of our approach. And it really kind of like borders between these types of things. And this is what ends up happening, is you end up getting this really schizophrenic type of idea where it ends up being like some type of weird hybrid. And it tends to really go against your ideas of individualism. Well, the reason why is because unless you actually dig deeper, and obviously there wasn't much information on the identity perspective at this time, being into the 60s to the 70s, there wasn't much information, because obviously that would have undercut the whole idea of what they wanted to move foreign policy to. Mind you, that the progressive era was something in which brought the liberal foreign policy perspective to essentially the forefront, and the realist foreign policy perspective had kind of been there like right before then, and was really kind of like the secondary thing right then and there. And so these things were kind of running neck and neck. And even though historically in the United States, the identity perspective has always been there since the start, is what it was never really kind of pushed forward. It was really kind of just something that we kind of accepted as what the founders wanted, not necessarily something that was really necessarily studied. It was just something that just was. This is kind of the constitutional system. And so if you didn't really look into the writings of the founders, you really weren't going to end up finding that. And unless you were really going out and trying to really do your best into looking into this, you weren't going to necessarily find anything on it. And I think what ends up happening is she didn't look into really the older into this older viewpoint. She accepted the modern viewpoints and what they were doing. And this meant that she was going to accept basically the war era to current viewpoints. And this was essentially completely erroneous. And it basically assumes a very, very naive version of the world. And it accepts this idea that basically either you intervene to, you have two options. Either you intervene to basically keep things as is, and it basically assumes that you basically have the right to control the world order, or B, it takes the idea that you have the right to essentially assume what people's governments are. And this is really against the ability for, number one, state sovereignty. It's if a state is to be if people are able to pick their own government, this essentially is violating that. And you're violating individual rights, because of, the idea of sovereignty of a state is to allow people to pick their own government, even as horrible as it is, even if it violates their every right, their every individual right, even if it violates that with it. No individual outside their own country with it has the right to do it. That's why when we try to make these democracies, they always fail. Now, if you want to actually change anything, that this is why historically, if people want to actually change things, they've always historically the way everything's been successful is through ideas. Ideas are the only ways to do it with. You need to spread the ideas, and that's the only way to do it. To use force, violent force never works. To try to beat something over somebody's head, they're never going to actually come around. And that's something that needs to be understood. And the basic ideas of objectivism, or individualism, I should say, are that basically this is the way you do it. You try to actually convince them that through ideas that this is a better idea. It's basically through basic debate, and that's something which must be understood. And this is pretty much what's understood, that you basically cannot use force on someone else. And when this is understood, it can be applied everywhere. If you start to take this idea of her foreign policy ideas and start applying it everywhere else, this would mean that basically you can essentially start diluting her own ideas, and say that basically that force is okay as long as you morally agree with it, and that essentially validates the Muslim idea of a caliphate, because they essentially feel that they have a moral obligation to establish a worldwide caliphate. Now, so did Hitler. Hitler felt he had a moral obligation to establish that worldwide Aryan race world government. That essentially would fit with the idea of allowing for force. Now, if you eliminate the idea of force, this makes it very difficult for either one of those to state those things, and you can't. That's why once you eliminate the idea of force and say force is always wrong, and you should always use some type of voluntary method, this is where it becomes different, and saying that one should always have the right to defend themselves. And when you start to do this, it starts to really dilute. It starts to really start to look into it and say that she was essentially just erroneously advised on her opinions, and merely it cannot be part of this former philosophy. And I believe objectivism would have had to have been a former philosophy for her, and that this idea of foreign policy would have just been a personal opinion. And people can have personal opinions on things. She could have felt that it would have been the idea of a moral thing, but that would essentially go into the idea of some type of Immanuel Kant's idea of deontology, which would have been complete violation, because you're saying it's a moral obligation for these things, not actually something that's actually for individuals. Because if we look at the actual effects of war, we know that you're actually killing individuals. You're supposedly saying that you want is free to make their own choices. And you're also declaring of what is a moral system and what is not a moral system. You're now being subjective in these ideas of this. And it boils down to basically the whole point of saying that there is no point at which you can actually state that this is an actual moral foreign policy system, because it isn't moral. It's completely erroneous on its base, and it's basically from lack of information. And that's what it's established from. That's why anybody that actually pushes for this should realize, and that basically you're essentially going against individual rights. You have to go against individual rights for war. War is essentially the destruction of individual rights. And when we start to go with James Madison, he understood this, and this would have been understood. And this is why when we looked at our foreign policy, specifically on statements from not only Madison, not only Jefferson, not only Washington, you would anybody would understand this, that this is the actual ideas. The ones who would push against this were the ones that actually wanted an expansion of government. And that was through the progressive era, and that's something completely different. And anybody that would realize that was an era in which there was a serious curtailing of human rights within the United States. Anybody that would say that they would actually agree with the curtailing of human rights is really going against the rights of the individual. That was when they started to push this idea of hardcore into collectivism, and the idea of viewing the ideas of some type of supremacy of a nation state and viewing all people under this collective of a nation state is erroneous, because if you view them as a collective, as a nation state, that would mean there'd be no reason to actually intervene, because you're always going to get something worse, and it's always going to be the same. If you view them, so the best option would be to ignore them and only focus on domestic security. If you actually view them as being a collective that cannot, as a total collective. Now, if you view them as basically a strong man that has people under them that are basically scared of the overthrowing, you merely would have called your only option, obviously, would be to try to use influence of ideas. The influence of ideas is the only way that you can actually do something. And this would be where you're not putting your hand, and your hands you don't have blood on your hands from the events. And this is where history actually has a huge impact of looking into the outcome, because when we start to look at how we handled areas of Europe next to areas of Asia with it on, such as communism, we can actually see that there was a big difference when we look at how we dealt with areas such as Vietnam. Vietnam, basically, for the most part, with it is another poor. For the most part, it's a very, very separated country, and it has a lot of. It's still very, very poor in many areas, and it's due to a lot of Marxism. And pretty much just recently with it, they've just started within the last, not much with it, they've just started to actually kind of come around to accept some bit of capitalism. When we start, this is what we end up doing with it by fighting them in Vietnam. Now, if you look at our actions in Europe were basically fought over ideas. We actually spread the point of ideas out there, and what ended up happening was, without any bloodshed, we actually got Europe to actually turn around against Marxism. And while there's still some areas of little pockets of it, it isn't like it was before, where it was just basically hardcore Marxism, and it's a former shade of itself within most of these areas that are into Marxism are actually not the ones that actually were originally. The ones that were originally are far from it. And this is just what ends up happening when you actually start to go away from that. And it ends up showing that it's something far different. And when you actually work on ideas are far more powerful. And if we end up keeping up with the ideas, you're talking globally, you could actually kill it. And especially if you don't go with very, very weak and diluted ideas, if you go with very, very strong and forceful ideas of the differences between pure capitalism and pure individualism, you're going to find out that it's going to succeed. It's going to go worldwide, and it's going to make a big difference, because you're not going to find. This is why you end up finding that her points were erroneous, and she didn't understand that. She seems like she didn't understand by not doing any research into the whole thing, and that's why when we start to look at some of the people who did, they had far better understanding of the whole concept of foreign policy. And to me, I'm this more flabbergasted that as a philosopher, because most philosophers don't even gravitate toward the idea of foreign policy. You might have more economists tend to do it with it, more like the Ludwig von Mises type with it, that tend to gravitate more into it because it tends to play into it. Because obviously, as war goes on, war is a negative effect uh, on the economy. So you might have more of those tend to go toward, and they would be a far better advocate to talk about foreign policy than someone who is going into the aspect of more on personal philosophy. Because if you look at ideas of many other philosophers, they didn't even discuss foreign policy. And that's why when we start to look at foreign policy, we shouldn't even really take any foreign policy seriously from the originator of the philosophy. Because when we start to look at even like Marxist foreign policy was never taken directly from Marx. It was actually extrapolated from his ideas, and it was people far later than him that actually created it. When the realist foreign policy had nothing to do with any type of idea that was actually created from any philosopher. The identity perspective had nothing to do with any type of philosopher. The feminist perspective has nothing to do with any feminist philosophers whatsoever. These are merely people who are actually writing specifically on foreign policy, who had actually created this perspective. And that's the major point that needs to be articulated. And why, and then when we get to the idea of Ayn Rand's perspective on the whole things of foreign policy, she's like the only one that I can think of offhand that actually had an idea on foreign policy. And it's kind of odd that she would even opined on it. And seeing that basically that when we start to look at her age, I mean, let's see, she did not basically opine on the thing until she was like at least 60 years old. So she wasn't exactly a spring chicken at this point. And it would be less likely that she would have actually had even made statements that would have actually been as coherent on the whole topic. Being that it didn't seem like that was her wheelhouse at all. She was more into literature and philosophy. This was her basic thing that she focused on. She knew a lot in those areas. It seems she was quite weak in history and quite weak in foreign policy. And these were things that she did not understand well. And when you start to look at that, that ends up playing very, very negatively for her topics. She had a decent grasp of economics, just kind of light grasp, I would say. She understood that basically the capitalism was because just through basic numbers, that capitalism was the best way to pull people out of poverty. And using pure capitalism, not a mixed economy. This is something that she understood, so she at least had that grasp. But she didn't really have a very, very well-versed grasp in it. But when it comes down to things like history, when it comes down to things like foreign policy, she didn't have a well-versed grasp, because when we start to look at passages, we only see a couple passages on foreign policy. And yet people tend to want to opine on her foreign policy. Now, one of her passages tends to focus on saying that people that look for trade tend to look for no damage, and yet on the other end they tend to say that people who look for war should be. Then on this other one that she ends up going on the passage right after, she ends up going this idea that we should be extremely hawkish, and essentially with it, and then people who've opined after that, I mean specifically from the Ayn Rand Institute, they've gone essentially and opined on the thing, and their opinions would essentially go on to the point that there would be Geneva Convention violations. Not just and the fact is, and they're wondering why even neocons won't go as far as that, and there's a reason why. There's actually international law against it, and this is the reason why. You can't do that. You cannot just nuke a country. You nuke a country, you're going to basically, all the people involved are actually going to go to prison, because there's actually law against that. And especially if you preemptively attack a nation that had nothing to do with anything, like you have Yaron Brooks said after 9/11 that we should have attacked Iran and Syria and maybe Saudi Arabia. Now, Saudi Arabia was the one that actually had stuff to do with it, and he's saying attack Iran and Syria. Well, Iran actually was the one that went after Al-Qaeda, who was actually responsible for the attack. Now, if you attack basically someone who's basically on your side to attacking an ally, that would essentially, that first of all is you're pretty much defeating your purpose of wanting to win. This essentially, all this is basically nothing but a vindictive attack, and doing it on the at the behest of Israel, who basically wanted to remake the Middle East. Nothing to do with actual legitimate foreign policy. Nothing to do with actual legitimate foreign policy benefits to the United States. This is doing it on behest of another country. And when you start to do that, you start to realize that you're not acting rational. That's not even acting in a rational manner. And this is something that is opined at the Ayn Rand Institute, and that's something that you're saying that if you want to, and you're saying, well, you're trying to make some assessment on it. Well, if you state that you should go after people who attack you, that this should be minimum. If someone attacks you first, you should basically go after them. The minimum on basically self-defense is if someone attacks you, you attack them. This would be fit with any type of foreign policy. You don't attack someone who's basically attacking your enemy. If you see someone attack you, then you have another guy next to you that ends up beating the hell out of your enemy. You don't all of a sudden go and stab that guy. That's not lawful. That's completely wrong. And then he's also advocated for ideas of just eliminating Iran for no reason. That's essentially like no different than seeing like a gang member a mile away from your house doing nothing, and then all of a sudden you stab and kill them. Guess what? You're going to be going to prison for life, minimum. If not, if it's a state with the death penalty, you're going to be going away for good. And this is the point. This is why we start to see that there's huge holes in this foreign policy idea, and they're extrapolating even further. And I think this idea of this saying that Israel has that this start to extrapolate that there's some type of idea that Islam doesn't have the moral authority that Judeo-Christian groups do, is where you start to go into some of the points that some of the progressive era things were saying that they could decide your moral authority, that individuals no longer have their own rights. And this is the whole point. And that's where everything, that's why a lot of these individualist movements came about, was because they were appalled by these movements. And when you start to look at these things, it's like on history, you can see her erroneous history started to play into this on Ayn Rand, that basically you could see that if you start to realize that the actions of World War I, created by British paranoia, created basically where they attacked Germany first. Germany then gets these sanctions, as well as it creates to basically reform the Middle East, where both Britain and France are basically taking controlling interest over the area, because of they want to make sure that Russia does not get to them first. Then creates a thing where Russia is basically overrun, where it becomes the Soviet Union. This creates a problem with the Soviet Union, and then leads to the rise of the Nazis, solely because of World War I. The blockade in World War II of the U.S. working with Maoist China, and mind you, China would not have become communist had the Soviet Union not become, because they had become allies after. And there was only once there had become that regional split, this was later, that had actually happened with it. But basically, before, with they were actually had become allies, and that's what actually allowed China to actually become communist. And they had actually formed their own sect of communism later, and they're still communist to this date. And that's basically due to the whole thing of actions of remaking the Middle East. They had actually weakened the system with it by basically trying to attack any type of interest of Russia. And this is the whole thing that ended up going on, because they were so paranoid of the Tsar system that they wanted to make sure that they weren't going to have any trade deals in the Middle East. So what do? They actually steal all these countries in the Middle East, take them all over in an actual deal. They had the audacity to call it a treaty, which was it was nothing but basically sanctions on Germany, as well as Austria and Hungary, as well as basically stealing vast swaths of land in the Middle East. And it basically created massive problems. And when you start to view this, that's the occurrence of it. Now, when you start to view the implications in modern day history, it's not the cause of Islam or anything like this, or radical Islam. It's basically that there's intervention is the actual cause of the problems in the Middle East. Because you look at what it called Islam outside of those regions, it doesn't tend to be a huge issue with it unless Saudi Arabia is allowed to intervene into those other areas. And basically Saudi Arabia has basically been getting kind of aid through a lot of the Western regions. And that tends to be more intervention, because Saudi Arabia has been getting all this help for all these decades because of oil. And this anti-Russian sentiment has fueled this. Now, if you go away from an anti-Russian sentiment, it will actually cure the problem and this whole thing of basically allowing Saudi Arabia to start spreading these problems. You're going to find out that it's not going to be an issue, because frankly, when you have over, was it 1.6, when you have like 1.6, 1.7 billion Muslims over the world with it, and if you think what it called that basically you're going to take all these radical Muslims and get rid of them, this is the idea of some of the people at the Ayn Rand Institute. You think you're going to get rid of them? It's a joke. You kill some of them with it, and then you're going to end up having casualties. You're going to kill innocent people. Those people are going to be, their family members are going to be radicalized, and it's going to keep on going forward and forward and forward. And you're going to create more and more and more, and you're going to raise the percentage of the radicalized Muslims. And it's going to be never ending. And instead, you can actually go with the idea of spreading ideas of basically capitalism, peace, and prosperity, and work your way at home with it, because frankly, they cannot get to the United States without help. Frankly, none of them can. If you're working from the United States with it, it's basically, it's like trying to it's like they're basically chained into one corner of a boxing ring and you're at the other corner. They only can punch you if you walk right up to them. If you're at the other end you're just sitting there relaxing, they can't do anything. You would have to essentially unchain them and either unchain them where they can go up to you, or essentially go right up to them and let them punch you in the face. That's essentially the equivalent. And nobody, and yet they're trying, and yet they're saying, oh, let's essentially unleash them with it, and or let's do essentially the equivalent of letting a bunch of their buddies in as well. And that's essentially what they've done. And what they're advocating for by basically wanting these to go and kill these create a bunch of casualties, which includes bombing churches, or bombing mosques, I should say, bombing hospitals, bombing buses. What do you think it's going to do? You're going to create a bunch of more people that want to kill us. They're not mad because of our freedoms. They're not mad because we support Israel, except for the fact that Israel is the aggressor in these conflicts. They're mad because the fact is we keep basically not letting them have a normal life. Now, if you basically go over there, you're basically putting like McDonald's businesses, McDonald's, Burger King, Walmart, Macy's. Frank, if you keep putting businesses like that up there, they're going to say, oh, hey, they're investing in us. Not realizing that you're basically going to slowly change your attitude, and they're eventually going to be far more secular. Mind you, that the Ottoman Empire was originally their headquarters were out of Turkey. Turkey is far more secular now. And if you keep pushing it, you can actually get these countries to actually fully change. This is just what ends up happening. And you're not going to actually fully, you're not going to basically fully wipe these people off the earth. They're not going to change. And frankly, you just need to basically get them to accept a common place and realize that we're going to have to work together and treat them as individuals. You're not going to basically say they have to change their religion or anything like that. That's not going to work. You're going to have to realize that no one can be labeled as superior or inferior. It's going to have to go. And that this is the point with it where her foreign policy doesn't really fit, and where we start to view that basically is a foreign policy that only protects our country. Because when we start to view this narrow idea of national interest, that's where the word starts to get all shady. National interest is a very, very shady word, because who gets to decide? That's the whole point. Who gets to decide? And that's why we start to view the idea of the points with it is that's why I say with the idea of objectivism, I believe objectivism would have probably gone through with it without her, because I don't think that we would have needed necessarily her whole points to get to that whole thing. We have people like Ludwig von Mises, and if you want to learn more about him, obviously there's stuff at the Mises Institute. Because you can obviously, he lived from 1881 to 1973, so he was actually born before her. He was from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Now it's actually part of Ukraine. Died in 73 at the age of 92 in New York City. Went to University of Vienna, and what it calls for his bachelor's, got his master's in Geneva, Switzerland, and his master's in New York University, or no, those are ones he actually taught in. Never mind. So we end up seeing that basically is he basically so he ended up basically being one that actually was one that was very, very influential in the United States. And though, even though he would go praise Ayn Rand for her work with it, the two obviously had a volatile relationship and strong disagreements over the moral basis for capitalism. And he basically would be considered as the idea of a classical liberal. And he was one that was basically one that was completely anti-war. And this is a person that was that understood basically is that both all war is basically destructive. And you're going to find him to be completely different than Rand, and in that perspective, being that he was essentially a far better studier of history, being that obviously in economics you really have to be. And he understood this, and he obviously understood the ideas of he understood basically is that the dangers of force. And he was, if you look at him, he's far more consistent. That's why when you start to look at him, is that he was very he would essentially basically be viewed as he was basically viewed as someone who would be basically completely different than Rand when it comes down to foreign policy, because he understood the difference. And this is why, and though I think because of this, he understood basically a far wider span of history, and this would have been why when we start to view it, is he understood far wider on economics, far wider on history, maybe not as what we call on as being as literary, as being as cultured on the literature, which was kind of more Rand's forte, but he was far more cultured on history and economics, which is definitely his forte. And if you're looking for something on that with it, I would say he's far more on that lines. That's why when it comes down to it, I end up being very influenced by his works. And that's where I tend to fall with, because I tend to fall in the idea where I understand that where in my personal life is I view myself as being fully pro-life. I'm against abortion, I'm against war, and I'm against the death penalty, because I believe it's completely destructive. If we view the actual person has the right to life, then it should be actually given fully. And it shouldn't just be under certain conditions. Now, I feel that both the left and the right do not understand this, and that they're kind of half-heartedly in their defense. in this. And this is where I tend to stand, and to basically understand with the idea of the individual. I mean, if we are to understand that, even on the basis of an atheist, if you're an atheist, you should understand the idea of being pro-life. I mean, to kill a life with it would basically be you're disposing of their whole purpose. Regardless, you don't even have to be a person who believes in a God or not. Basically, you're saying that if you believe your life basically starts at birth, ends at death, essentially you're stating that if someone terminates that, they're essentially terminating someone's full ability to experience that. And when we find people that have basically could have been aborted with it, have had very productive lives, and essentially many of them have, like my fiance, have actually advocated for individual liberty in their lives and personal responsibility. You should actually be completely against abortion, and there's really no legitimate reason. You can't say, oh, but there's a chance for a birth defect. What does that even mean? How where do we even have the rights to actually decide what actually means quality of life? I mean, at what point do we decide that someone's right to live and die? Because that's really, I mean, that you're boiling it down to those certain things with it. If we believe in individualism, you should not have the right to take anything away from anybody. And that's the whole point. And I don't believe that anybody should have any right to take the lives away from anybody. And especially when it comes down to as a state. I mean, you're talking once one government, on the foreign policy perspective of Rand, is basically one state can take lives away from a person of another state, especially just innocent people. That's completely erroneous. And that's why I'm going to end it right here with it. That's about it. And bye, everyone.